Hello, everyone. We will be starting our Q1 briefing session in a few moments. While we give our audience a chance to tune in, let me share a few operational notes. Feel free to send in questions using the chat or Q&A function throughout the presentation. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Please note that this program will be recorded. And as always, I want to thank our anchor signers, Arbella Insurance Group, Mass General Brigham, Mass Mutual, State Street, and Vertex Pharmaceuticals for their continued generous support, which allows us to bring you programs like the one today. So let us begin. Welcome, Compact Signers, to our Q1 briefing session for 2024 entitled Surviving DE&I Politics, Keeping Equity a Priority Moving Forward. The title kind of says it all. The landscape for diversity, equity, and inclusion programs has changed dramatically in the last year. How do we keep our programs strong, useful, and most importantly, funded in an environment where the term diversity itself is under assault? I'm Kim Borman, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Workforce Council. All of us gathered here today endorse closing gender and racial wage gaps at our workplaces. As 100% talent compact signers, you are the heroes of Greater Boston because you have committed to changing policies and practices that leave marginalized groups behind in regard to promotions and higher salaries. If your job wasn't hard enough, you're likely now facing backlash and objections from both inside and outside your organization. Our discussion today is meant to give you some context and ideas about what steps you can take to strengthen your programs in light of this changing environment. We hope you leave today with concrete tactics to try in your organizations based on what our panel has seen work elsewhere. With that, let me introduce our esteemed panel. I am joined today by three people who are on the front lines when it comes to building and supporting robust work environments. Ian Matthew Clayton is the Vice President and Chief Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Officer for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and has seen firsthand how diverse workforces improve patient outcomes. Ian also is a BWWC council member. Eric Nguyen is the Director of Inclusion Boston at YW Boston. He leads the team that designs and delivers a range of diversity, equity, inclusion programs to client organizations. Some of you in the audience today might very well have participated in the highly respected YW Boston programs his team facilitates. Shirley Leung is a well-known columnist and editor for the Boston Globe who covers business news, especially as it relates to innovation and growth, politics, gender, and race. She is also the host of the weekly Globe opinion podcast, Say More with Shirley Leung. So let's start today by hearing from each of you your perspective on where DEI efforts stand today. Shirley, can you give us a broad overview of what you're seeing in the greater business world due to this new environment?
Well, thank you, Kim, for having all of us here to talk about such an important issue. And so I've been writing a column for a little more than a decade. And I actually started this column because I want to put a spotlight on the lack of women on boards, and quickly, morphed into writing about gender diversity and diversity issues in the workplace. And I think for the most part, for the past decade, it's been a great topic for me. I mean, so many companies and organizations year after year have championed, women and people of color in the workplace and advancing them. But it has been very different, in the last year. But of course, the effort for diversity kind of was supercharged after the murder of George Floyd. But then, after the Supreme Court banned race in admissions at Harvard, it's been a completely different landscape. Ed Bloom, who successfully sued Harvard, has vowed to take a similar strategy in the private sector, and you're already starting to see him go after law firms, their internships that target students of color. He's sued a venture capital firm that sets aside money for Black women entrepreneurs. And so and I find that companies and organizations are scared. Some are pulling back their programs, not committing as much funding. Meanwhile, there are other companies who are kind of doubled down, and said no. Diversity, equity, inclusion is really important. Research has shown that this is better for the bottom line, and so we're going to stick to it. So you're seeing a period of who's really committed and who's not, and that's playing out right now.
That's interesting. Ian and Eric, can you tell us from your perspectives what you're seeing with the shifting environment and particularly at your organizations, the programs that you have? Ian, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you, Kim, and hello, everyone. I think, Shirley was spot on in her description of the landscape. And I think, for sure, from my perspective, I've definitely had more conversations with our legal counsel than I've ever had since I've started at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So there's definitely that piece. But I also love to put things into some broader sort of perspective. The work of DE&I has been going on for many, 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 many years, right? And so it started off as sort of like in a compliance EEO sort of phase, and it's sort of morphed and evolved into what it is today. And so I do think it's just very important that we don't sort of shut our curtains and hide behind our sort of closed doors. And we just remind everyone the value of this work. Shirley talked about the bottom line, right? That this work really impacts the bottom line. And so it's, for me, from my perspective, and Kim, you mentioned it, for us at Dana-Farber, we're a cancer hospital, right? And so for us, patient outcomes and patient satisfaction is very important. So we know there's a lot of research that shows that a diverse workforce really impacts patient outcomes and patient satisfaction. And so we just continue to sort of message that and remind everyone that there is value in this work. I just encourage everyone to really just continue to share and continue to remind everyone what we're doing has a lot of value and has a lot of importance. It's unfortunate that so many organizations are doing the opposite, right? As I said, closing their curtains and sort of hiding, but just remind everyone there's a lot of value in the work that we're doing.
Eric, what are you seeing, especially in sort of your client programs?
Yeah, definitely. So Shirley, Ian, thanks for sharing your insights, perspectives. A lot of what you're saying resonates with me. And whenever I hear that question, what's the DEI landscape look like today? My mind immediately goes to all of the bad stuff first. But as I continue to reflect on this, there's actually a lot of good happening, especially as we look at organizations and companies who are in this for the long haul, right? And so yes, the legal landscape is creating a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation about doing this work. I'm also seeing a lot of decreasing budgets that, people's attention has shifted. Right after, the murder of George Floyd, we had this racial reckoning. Lots of organizations, lots of companies pledged to spend money to do this work. And I think a lot of research has shown that maybe that didn't actually happen when we look at the, the paper trail and the money trail. But also, we've been talking about this looming recession for a while. And I think there's been a tightening of budgets that's pulling people away from doing some of this work. Then I'll also add there's a lot of DEI fatigue, that this is really hard work, and it takes a toll on people, and it especially takes a toll on the folks who are leading this work. So DEI practitioners, folks who are in leadership roles who are pushing this work, and certainly a lot of the folks who hold, right, the marginalized identities that they're trying to uplift and to try to bring to the forefront. And I think that's some of the stuff I'm seeing. But here's the good, right? That when we're working with organizations, there's an increasing awareness that this is an ongoing journey. There is no finish line, and that we need to continue to do the work, to build momentum, to take those steps, but that the finish line is not necessarily a tangible place that we're trying to reach. I think that's one. Second, and this was reflecting what Ian said, is that this work is about people. And I use the business case all of the time. And I also want to remind us that this work is ultimately about people. And, it's about each one of us and how we show up and how we can become so the best version of ourselves in our workplace, in our communities, and so on. And I think there's an increasing awareness that that is equally important, and we're not just talking about bottom lines. Seeing that people are moving beyond just education and awareness. So a lot of, what we were seeing early on is just workshops. Can you do a workshop on identity? Can you do a workshop on implicit bias and microaggressions? I think there's still a lot of need for education, but people are now looking at like, how do we take action? What can we actually do now that we've elevated the foundational, the baseline knowledge of our leadership teams, of our staff, and so on? And they're beginning to think of systems and structures. So this is not just, individuals taking action, but how are we thinking about, dismantling oppressive systems, at that structural level? What are our policies that are holding people back, and how do we change them to be more equitable and inclusive? And then lastly, I'll say, people are really thinking about how do we embed DEI into our day to day so that it's not an extra thing that we do. It's not an add-on, which quickly gets shoved aside when other priorities come to the fore. But how are we making sure that we're centering DEI in everything that we do and that it's part and parcel of the work?
Thanks, Eric. Are the conversations changing around DE&I? I mean, you said, Eric, they're starting to look at these programs versus those programs. Do you feel like that's to support themselves with all the objections that are out there? So I guess I would ask all three of you, because of this backlash, because of what we're seeing, are you having to position DE&I in a different way?
Yeah, I was going to just build on what Eric was saying earlier. I mean, I think one of the silver linings of this moment we're in, it kind of forces everyone to re-examine or re-examine their DEI programs. Are they as strong as they can be? If there's criticism internally, externally about programs, what can we do to make them better? And I mean, I'll just say that at a high level. And I mean, I think about my own organization. I mean, I feel like I don't think a lot of that many organizations, at least here in Massachusetts, are definitely rolling back. But I think we're strengthening, to what Eric was talking about. I think we're strengthening the programs. How do we move beyond diversity training? How do we move more into mentorship and sponsorship? What I also love and I write about is not only an internal focus, but externally, it expands to, who we contract with. Diversity is not just our workforce, but our community. Are we, our vendors diverse? And so I think that is happening. So I like that part of this period we're in. We're thinking a little bit out of the box and bigger, even as the concept is under attack.
Well, that's great. Ian, are you seeing the same thing? What are your conversations like? Are you having to defend your programs?
Absolutely. I think doubling down on the business, on the why, is just so important right now. But, I think at the heart of a lot of what the sort of criticism of this work has been is that some of the programs feel like they are exclusive, right? That they're not as inclusive as they can really be. And I think, really trying to make sure that we're sort of defining our programs, articulating our programs as being more inclusive than exclusive is really very important in terms of making sure that we're not sort of positioning ourselves or getting ourselves in trouble. I think over the last couple of years, with the murder of George Floyd, there has rightly been a lot of focus around race and ethnicity. Rightly so, right? We are in the United States of America, but there's a lot of work that we still have to do as a country around social justice. But I think that's probably one of the most polarizing sort of topics around. And I think we're just seeing that this sort of focus specifically on race and ethnicity in terms of like DEI programs have really sort of started to make a lot of folks really sort of become very defensive around it and very sort of against it. And so I think we have to just remind the community that this work is about inclusive, creating equitable environments is important for all of us, right? But also what's been wonderful is starting to think about, okay, you don't want me to focus on this. What can I do? Where can we meet, right? What can we all agree on? And I think, all of us should start looking at programs, that we haven't really focused a lot of time and attention on. Accessibility and disability. We've been talking about that on the periphery, but we haven't really done the real deep work around that. Focusing on neurodiverse communities, focusing on veterans. I think the Supreme Court just ruled, right? They ruled against affirmative action broadly in universities, but they allowed it at West Point, right? So they allowed it from the sort of veterans. So there is places where I think we can sort of like all agree that we can really sort of focus our time and attention on. And then the last thing that I would say about that, just specifically to Dana-Farber, you'll hear me say Dana-Farber instead of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, is, as I mentioned earlier, workforce diversity is a strategic goal for us around ID&E, and that's because we know that it impacts patient outcomes. What we've done is we've really moved away from sort of like metrics-driven goals, and so instead of a goal that says we're going to increase our workforce by X percentage of this race or this ethnicity, we're sort of taking a more holistic approach to this work. We're creating programs that just help hiring managers recruit better generally and broadly. That way they have more diversity in their applicant pools. And so really taking that more general approach to goals as opposed to like narrowly saying we're going to identify this specific group, I think helps us position it better so that folks are not misinterpreting what we're trying to do as quotas, right? It will have the same outcome in the end, that we're sort of like, really sort of building the capacity of our hiring managers to do this work better, to recruit and attract more diverse talent. But then on the flip side, folks are not looking at it like, oh, here's another quota that you're trying to sort of fulfill. So definitely, looking at all of our programs with that sort of like lens is what we're doing now. Eric?
Thanks. Yeah, you both covered a lot of ground. I'm thinking, like, what can I add to this? Because you covered so much there. I want to go back to this idea, right, that there's this perception that a lot of the work that we're doing within the DEI space feels exclusive to folks. And how are we shifting that narrative? I was recently reminded of this listening to an NPR segment. I think this was mid-January or so. And there was a segment about expanding the child tax credit. And there's a lot of talk about class and race and the intersections of race and class. And the host said, how will this tax expansion, this tax credit expansion benefit, Black and brown children, Black and Latino children? And the guest, without missing a beat, said, I want to be clear that this expansion will benefit children of all races. And then, went into some of the data about how it would actually benefit children of all races before digging into some of the more disaggregated data about how it would impact Black and brown children, given the historical legacy of racism in our country. And I think that is something that we need to think about, is how are we, I talked earlier about awareness. And what we need to do is bridge the gap between saying, now that you're aware of these, like, how do we actually incentivize and motivate people to take action? So I think that there's a huge gap there right now, that people are aware that there may be issues, but they're not yet motivated to act on it. And how do we bridge that gap? I think helping people understand that this work is about all of us, that we all stand to gain from it, is really important. So, Ian, you mentioned, some of the work that you're doing internally. If we're creating much clearer promotion pathways within an organization, we may be thinking about that first and foremost about, historically marginalized groups that we haven't seen as many Black employees promoted. We're thinking through that lens, but ultimately the work that we do will benefit all of our employees, regardless of race, regardless of background. How are we framing it that way? How do we make sure that everyone understands that? The other thing I think a lot about is Kenji Yoshino, I think he was at NYU, did a lot of work around this concept of covering. The idea that we all show up to work or other spaces and we intentionally cover or hide certain aspects of our identity because we feel this strong need to fit in, to belong with whatever the dominant narrative is in that particular space. And when we look at the data, you might imagine that people of color, members of the LGBTQ plus community, high percentages of folks in those communities cover. Anywhere between 70 to 80% of folks will say, like, I cover. And the question I was like, what about white men? We think about white men as holding, right, really dominant identities within our race and gender structures. And 46% of white men report covering as well. To me, it's a reminder that we're not solely defined by our race. We're not solely defined by our gender, but we all hold a constellation of identities. And that for us to be truly inclusive, we have to see the entire person, that we have to look beyond the visible identities and understand that we all hold a lot of identities that are invisible, that don't surface unless we create spaces where people can bring those to the forefront. So I think those are important things for us to be thinking about, to be talking about, to ask questions about. And so, when I think about the work that we do at YW Boston, we believe that race and gender matter. They're really important. They're at the core of a lot of the systemic inequalities and inequities that we see. So the language I often use is that we are race and gender explicit, but we're not race and gender exclusive. So if a client comes to us and says, we'd really like to dig into ability, disability, right, neurodiverged, well, like, great, let's talk about that. But we don't want to lose track of how those identities intersect with race and gender. We're not going to leave that off to the side. We're not going to say we're not talking about race and gender, but it's race, gender, and what are the other identities we want to bring to the table?
So the very first question we've got from the audience, I think the three of you have answered. Is it a decent strategic move for those of us who are DEI practitioners to shift the conversation to global proficiency, which is, I think, what you're saying. If I understand global proficiency, it's how we all will be better versus just one group. And that's where you're all going. That's what you're saying is sort of the language that you should now be using when you're talking about your programs. Sounds like it.
Yeah, I would definitely say that when you're talking about your programs, first of all, we work in organizations, right? So you want to tie it to the business goal. So really try to really make sure that you have a solid articulation and an understanding of how your DE&I programs impact business outcomes, right? And so I talk about that again, just driving that at Dana-Farber, patient outcomes, patient satisfaction is very important that we create that inclusive environment. But then I do think, Kim, in terms of what this person is getting at, that it is important. Eric just articulated it so well that we really help our communities understand that this work really benefits us all. And so really sort of making that case that, yes, we're going to do a lot of work because we've seen that in our organization, our African-American women are lagging behind. And so we're going to do a lot of great work to really make sure that we can get them, bring them up to equity, but at the same time, getting them there and creating equitable processes really benefits us all. And so really sort of driving the message in that way. So you're not losing the core of what you're trying to do, which is very important. You're trying to lift everyone, lift up communities that have not really been, that are sort of lagging behind, but you're not excluding others, and you're really sort of making that case of why it matters for us all.
Are you aware, Shirley, of organizations that have a good process in place for addressing racism experienced by staff within the organization? This is actually an audience question, but I was wondering if from your sort of bird's eye view, if you've seen organizations that you felt they're really doing a good job of addressing racism.
Racism internally or
Internally within the organization.
I mean, I guess I don't cover at that granular level. I mean, maybe Eric might know better because the YW works with individual organizations, and maybe this has come up about individual companies dealing with racism internally. I mean, usually when it comes to my level, I'm writing about the bad stuff, right? I'm writing about the
Yeah, as
lawsuits
opposed to how they solved it.
the
Good point.
whistleblowers.
Yeah.
So, but Eric, maybe that's something that you've come across in kind of the programs that you've rolled out.
Yeah, definitely. Before I do that, I want to circle back to the question about global proficiencies too. I think when I think about global proficiencies, I think both about the outputs, which we've been talking about, but also about the inputs, that at the end of the day, we want to help everyone understand that not only are we all beneficiaries of DEI work, but we're all expected to be contributors to DEI work. And so part of that then is making sure that we're elevating the level of education, awareness, competencies that folks have, whether you're new staff to an organization or whether you're at the managerial level and you're in charge of hiring, promoting, sometimes firing, or you're at the leadership level, right? Setting metrics and goals for the organization. Again, if we're going to do all of that work through a lens that centers diversity, equity, inclusion, then we do need to make sure that somewhere along the way, people are getting the information and the education they need to be able to do that work effectively. So I'm thinking both, right, about the outputs, which we've been talking about, but also about the inputs, like who is doing this work? It really should be all of us, and not just a select few, right, or a small group of people within the organization. I think, right, the more that people feel as like they personally stand to gain, the more they will be incentivized and motivated to contribute to the work moving forward as well. In terms of thinking about racism, addressing racism within organizations, a lot of it does start with measuring, right, our current state and understanding where we are, right? What are our, Ian, like, you've done a lot of work, right, within, talent acquisition, talent retention. So would love to hear a little bit more about, some of the things that you've done and seen, but we need to understand where we are, right? What does it currently look like? If we're thinking about, within the past year, let's look at all the people that we've hired. What's the racial breakdown of that group? Is that representative of the communities that we're serving, right? Are we, how is that compared to just the racial demographics of the applicant pool? How are we diversifying the applicant pool? I think those are, initial steps to think about how are we just diversifying our workforce. But we know that simply creating a diverse community doesn't necessarily mean that we'll benefit from having that diverse community. And that's where we make that shift from diversity to thinking about equity. What are the experiences of the people there? So I mentioned earlier, thinking about, promotion pathways and helping people understand. I think one strategy I've seen that's been really effective is to think about how are we creating internal professional development opportunities for folks. So, working with an organization that said, in order for people to advance within our organization, they need certain levels of training. In this particular case, there's actually some certification that folks needed to move into a more senior position that required supervision. And up until that point, folks had to pursue that certification on their own time, on their own dime. And this organization said that is leading us to a situation where the only people who are eligible, right, are folks who historically have been eligible, right, are wealthier staff, are white staff who have access to these networks. So they created an internal program in which on company time, they paid for certification training courses. They paid for folks to take the exam. All of a sudden, their pool of eligible people to be promoted grew pretty substantially. And from there, they were able to promote and create a much more racially diverse, supervision, right, team, a much more diverse managerial team. And I think those are some ways in which organizations can rethink, like, how are we restructuring ourselves? How are we rethinking the policies and systems that are in place and changing those so that we can address the historical barriers that we've seen?
Ian, is there something in place to measure success at Dana-Farber in terms of the programs you've put in place? And can you name tactics that you feel that have really worked and some that have not?
Absolutely. I think we measure our demographics, right? So we have dashboards that allow us to see our workforce demographics broken up by race and ethnicity, by gender. We're also now exploring a lot of work around intergenerations. So sort of getting the pulse of what our Gen X is thinking and feeling, our Gen Y, and really starting to sort of overlay all of those metrics on top to really sort of get that full picture But really one that I want to mention, because it's really interesting because it's sort of, we talk about training, right? And I think that there's a lot of, training doesn't work and a lot of sort of conversations around that. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, Dana-Farber, like a lot of many organizations, we had a reckoning, right? It's not like we weren't doing a lot of work before, but we doubled down on the efforts and we wanted to hear the voices of our workforce. Like, what was the workforce asking us? Like, what were they experiencing? What were they feeling? And especially our workforce of color. And we got a lot of information. At the same time, it just so happened that we were having our biannual engagement survey. So we were able to gain some great information from our employee engagement survey, and we added what we called a diversity index to that engagement survey. So we heard all of these themes, and the workforce told us that, look, if you want to have an inclusive environment, we need our managers, our leaders, us to have more cultural competence, to understand what health equity is, to reduce bias. And so they wanted training. They actually wanted training. And so we developed what we called an ID&E Foundation education, and we implemented it to the entire workforce. Well, 2 years later, late last year, we had another engagement survey, and we are starting to see those results, and we're actually seeing that it worked. So our diversity index actually improved. So the workforce, particularly the question around whether we're committed, is where I think really sort of the workforce, with our listening to them around education and then implementing it, I think that's where they think that we've really shown that we were committed and we were going to take action. Now, on the flip side of that, education is just like one piece of it, right? And I think there's even a question in here, like, how do you go past that, right? And so what's been wonderful is we've started to see a lot of teams just come to us very organically and naturally, say, hey, we love this education, but now we want to apply it in a clinical setting. Like, how can we apply it with our patients? How can we apply it with our interactions with families, of different cultures and backgrounds? And so our team has been really sort of doing some bespoke development of trainings that really start to get to sort of very specific scenarios that help our workforce sort of understand how to apply it in their day-to-day. And so I think, surprisingly, the training aspect has really been successful for us in terms of like noticing it in our employee engagement survey and in this appetite and this desire from the workforce to just want more. So that's one sort of way that I think we've sort of seen some success and measured it.
This is probably for all of you a question from the audience, but maybe Shirley, you've seen some of this. Question is, DEI has come up for better or for worse in politics. What role do you think local government has in DEI work, if any? And how do you see local government leading in the prioritizing of DE&I?
Well, local government and government in general plays a big role, as long as our local state governments stay committed to diversity programs and policies, I think the private sector will also continue on that front. Now, if President Trump, I hate to bring in that level of politics, but I mean, let's be real here. If Trump returns to the White House, it's a whole nother, we'll have another landscape for DEI. I mean, when he was in office, he signed an executive order that basically banned and restricted diversity training at federal agencies and contractors. And when President Biden, was elected, day one, he reversed that ban. And so, in other words, government plays a leading role either way, right? And so, if our local government, if Boston, Massachusetts, stays committed to diversity and equity inclusion, I think everyone else will follow for the most part. And even if Trump comes back, I think I think we're going to try to stand our ground is my prediction. Because one of the things is that a lot of this stuff is going to the courts. So and I've talked to the lawyers for civil rights here in Boston. I mean, they defend a lot of these cases, right? And their advice to clients who are worried that their diversity programs might come under up to legal challenge is like, fight it, and we'll help you fight it, because they don't want to set a precedent that affects other diversity programs. So fight it. And so, but yes, government plays a big role and has a big influence in DEI programs.
Well, I mean, we, being partnering with the mayor and private sector, we're the only group, the Boston Women's Workforce Council is really the only group out there that does it and puts metrics behind it. So, and we found it quite effective in terms of at least giving people a benchmark. So I agree with you. There is a question about fairly new implemented D&I councils at different private organizations. And do any of you have strategies for how to communicate what they're trying to do at a high level, especially with the environment as it is? So probably they're talking about organizations that aren't as sophisticated as Dana-Farber.
Eric, I would love to hear
What do they emphasize in their messaging?
For me, I always go back to understanding purpose. Think about mission, purpose, values, both at the council level, but also thinking about the organization or the company level, and how are those two things aligned? That if you're on diverging paths, the council is likely not going to survive. They're not going to be able to accomplish the work that they want to do. And so how are we tying the work to, right, organizational priorities? What are, the short-term, long-term goals that we see? How might the work of the DEI Council feed into that, inform the work, advance the work, and so on? I think a lot about this notion of interest convergence. So this is a term coined by Derek Bell, and it's a strategy I've used quite often, that we may not necessarily have the same motivations or priorities in mind, but there may be a way to marry those two to get at the same outcomes at the end of the day. I'll actually use an example that worked really well for me. So I came from a background in higher ed, did a lot of student affairs worked with students who were first generation college students of color, and doing a lot of work around student retention. And one of the things that came up was food insecurity on campus. How do we address food insecurity? Thinking about food pantries on campus, thinking about community fridges, how are we connecting folks to each other? And there's a lot of pushback because of the cost of implementing a program like that, both in terms of staff, infrastructure, so on. There are certainly legal pieces to this that we would need to address. And yet the cost of student retention, or rather student attrition, was also really high. My team, the group of students I'm working at, came at this from more of a moral background, of a student service background, and yet we also had to communicate in terms of the bottom line story and the cost of the university in terms of real dollars, of losing students, of having to recruit more. So here's a real moment of interest convergence, that we each had different interests, and yet they converged to the same outcome that we were actually able to implement, right? That food security program. Thinking about food pantries, community fridges, a really robust program of support, budget dollars being dedicated to doing this work. And so within, our organizations, there's oftentimes a lot of opportunity to think about interest convergence as well. So I think that's one thing I would really think about. The communications piece is just reminding people that you're there. Anytime you're new, it's really easy to be forgotten. So how are you making sure that you're plugging into all staff meetings? Is there something that you can share out in that moment? If you have an internal communication system, you're on Slack, you're on Teams, how might you make your presence known there? And then I would say, how are you inviting people into the conversation? What are those listening sessions that you might hold? How are you helping people to voice concerns that they have? I think those are all things that I would do early on as a new council to begin to establish yourself, to understand what the specific needs are. And again, those listening sessions also begin to get, help you gain buy-in from folks in terms of the work that you want to do moving forward as well.
Ian, I mean, let me back up. I would imagine much of our audience today are DE&I practitioners. And so
Maybe.
are you seeing well, it is. What are people leading D&I efforts facing in the current climate? And are you seeing titles change? Are you seeing people leaving it? People are being laid off? Are they going elsewhere to different kinds of industries? What is you're seeing right now among sort of your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, that's the part that really hurts my heart. I'm a very sort of like feely person, and so it really sort of like I can feel the pain of my colleagues and sometimes myself, right? That this is, a lot of my colleagues are getting swept up in misinterpretation of words, their letters and newsletters and things that they're saying, and it's all being sort of like misinterpreted, and it's impacting sometimes their jobs, right? Some individuals that I know have sort of resigned because they just could not take the pushback on something that they said that folks are sort of misinterpreting. So I think that there is a lot of that happening, which honestly just feels very sad, right? It's just very, very unfortunate and sad. And I think a lot of organizations are sort of changing the titles of these roles. But you know what? I say if they change the titles of the roles, but they're still doing this amazing work, but in a different title in different ways, then again, it's sort of like the evolution of DEI, right? When we were EEO focused and now what we are today. And so I think that is okay, that we can have different titles and different roles, but I really, it's really worrisome when, so many of my colleagues are impacted in such a negative way. I'm going back to when Shirley was talking about politics and like, it depends on, who's in office. And I do wish, the other wish that I have is that there were more organizations that are sort of social justice focused or, that sort of speak out, that have been really, it's almost like so many people have been silent. Like this work is so important and so impactful that I think, it's important to remind people of why we do this work and why it has value. And we need the large organizations and some of the nonprofits to join the chorus, because there's another chorus happening of folks that are sort of like really sort of, mobilizing around the dismantling of it. And so, I really would like to see more organizations that are sort of, and they're coming. You're hearing a little bit more. The NAACP in Florida has sort of talked a little bit about what's happening, but that's just so important that we need more. Shirley, I think you're about to
Yeah, I was
dive
going to
into
say,
this one.
I agree with you 1,000%. I mean, the other side is so organized. They've been working on this for years, laying the groundwork for years, if not decades. And those of us who, who support DEI, I feel like we didn't see it coming. We don't realize the depth of the opposition, and that if you think about what happened at Harvard, first with the race-based, the ban on race in college admissions, and then Claudine Gay, first Black woman president. There was almost a conservative mob that went after her. They didn't want to see her there, and they found a way to discredit her. And I don't think they're done. So I think Ian, you're absolutely right. There has to be groups out there getting organized and fighting back. I mean, we are really in a culture war, and maybe it's not ground zero quite yet in Massachusetts, but because we have a Harvard here, and because we have so many, we do have a lot of progressive companies or organizations. I mean, they might be the next target. And so we all have to kind of be ready and to rally.
I'll add, Kim, can I add something really quickly too? I think this conversation is making me think about, I think hearing Shirley say, the opposition is really organized. I think like, yes, they're incredibly organized, and they're playing into, I think, very real human emotions and our deep-seated, just instinctual reactions, right? So I think a lot about bias, and in the concept of DEI work, we often think about bias as like implicit bias, right? Unconscious bias. What are those deep-seated beliefs we have about other people in terms of their identities? But I think about bias much more globally in terms of just what are those shortcuts, right? What are those natural inclinations that we have? Like, what is human nature to us? And one of those things, right, is that humans are incredibly risk averse, like we're irrationally risk averse. So what are those things that we can learn from, behavioral economics, right? Adult learning theory, motivation theory, to help us understand how do we tap into, right, those same core instincts that people have? Because right now, right, people are reacting to fear, they're reacting to uncertainty. And how do we help to change some of that, right? Because I do believe that a lot of those instincts are also fueling people's beliefs around like zero-sum thinking, right? That if somebody else benefits from this, then I or somebody else must necessarily lose something, as opposed to understand that maybe we can all be elevated, right? That we can create more opportunities for people. This idea of scarcity mindset, right? That there aren't enough resources to go around. I think, again, that feeds into that risk averseness that we have. And I think that makes DEI change that much harder for us to accomplish. And so as we move forward, I think there's a lot of learning that we need to do about human nature so that we can really tap into the potential that exists to help move people, again, from that awareness and education to action.
Eric, I think you had said when we talked previously that you have clients who came to you and said, we're battle scarred. We had some people in who weren't so good, and they positioned DE&I in such a way that it just drove people away from the entire seminars. How do you talk to them? How do you talk them back into the fold if they've already spent money on it and it was sort of a disaster?
It's a great question. I think a lot of it is this work is about relationship building. It's about trust. And so with these potential clients or partner organizations, it may mean that the lead up, right, from initial point of inquiry to when we might say we're ready to move forward with a formal partnership, it just might take a little bit longer. Sometimes it's actually, we're getting more and more requests actually to meet with staff. And so, the head of DEI or the head of HR, some team leader might be the first person to reach out, but they'll say, before we can move forward, my staff actually needs to meet you, or to meet the facilitators who are going to be working with us. Let's begin to build that relationship, because if that's not there, then we can't move forward. And so what I'm seeing is that I think folks have been burned, they've been scarred, and yet they know that this work is important. They want to try again, but they're going to be a little bit more cautious. And as a DEI practitioner, and I would say this to all of us, I think we need to recognize that that's what we're working with. That, again, this is a long-term, right, piece of work that we're engaged in. So we also need to be patient. I think the work feels really urgent. The work is really urgent. And yet, we can't force it through if people aren't ready to do the work. We have to meet them where they are and then help shepherd them along.
The last question I have right now is from a junior staffer who said, how do I make the argument for DE&I if calling for change, but the leadership doesn't seem to prioritize the work? Is there something I can say? Is there something I should do? Any of you can answer.
I always say, and we talked about this a lot, which is that understanding, the impact to the business and why this work is so important. And so, really, I don't know what industry this individual works in, but, really making sure that they understand, right? Educate yourself to make sure that you understand why this work is important and how it can impact the business outcomes. And then, everyone has a voice at their place, at the table that they sit, right? And so perhaps there's an opportunity, just even in your small team meeting. At Dana-Farber, what's been happening, which has just been fantastic, is like all of these sort of like department ID&E groups have just organically formed, where there's like an individual in the department that says, hey, I want to, does anyone want to read a book with me, a DE&I focused book, and next thing you know, the department has a council that sort of like tries to make that specific department better in whatever they do. A pharmacy department, for example, just recently launched their DE&I council. And I'll tell you all, I missed the party, but they had this whole recipe book that had like all of these different versions of hot chocolate from all different cultures. And, that's very small, but it really does impact and creates this sort of like inclusive culture and inclusive environment. And so, just make sure that you understand why this work is important and how it impacts your business, and then figure out, where you sit, if it's with your supervisor, your manager, maybe you are part of some inter-department group, because you're working on a project where you can start to share your experiences and what you think is important, and you can make an impact from the ground up. I definitely believe that.
Do you have any suggestions regarding advising internal DEI groups related to their focus of work on a more global diversity and inclusive level? How do we achieve the work of D&I committees, and how do D&I committees advance initiatives ensuring that this work is actually done? So I think what we're getting at here is the idea of, okay, there's a lot of talk, but how do you make it into action? So is there anything that you suggest, besides just having councils or just having discussions? How does it get into action?
Well, Kim, this is what BWWC has been doing for many years now. It's like, what gets measured gets done, right? And I'm a firm believer in that. And so, I think companies should track their diversity efforts, policies, the effectiveness of them, and share it. I mean, not set up quotas like Ian talked about, but I think people need to know, companies and organizations need to know where they stand. And I feel that, when I think about what BWWC does and other similar groups around town, I mean, every year there's every year you publish, or every other year you publish numbers about, gender wage gap, or number of women in the boardrooms, that everybody collectively can track progress. And so I think metrics do matter, and with when it comes to DE&I. And so I think if you can come up with a system that's not exclusive, but that feels inclusive, I think that would be good.
I think you're right. I think tracking is right. So in our final minutes, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to give one piece of advice to the audience, and that they can take back to their workplace. Because I think that's what we promise in these briefing sessions, that there'll be something actionable that they can take back. So Eric, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Happy to kick us off here. My piece of advice is this. I think right now, a lot of our DEI work still feels really reactive, right? We're comparing past to present. What has historically happened? Where are we now? And really think about how can we be more proactive. I was actually looking at some data yesterday. Some of this came from Ernst & Young, saying Gen Z, right, identifies as LGBTQ plus at 6 times the rate of Gen X individuals. So this is from survey work they had done. Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ plus at 6 times the rate of Gen X individuals. Couple that with the fact that by 2030, so we're talking 6 years from now, Gen Z is going to comprise 30% of our workforce. So we have an age, and we have a gender sexuality intersection here that we need to be thinking about. BIPOC folks are going to comprise 40% of our workforce. And we know from the US Census that by 2045, right, they're projecting the US will be white minority. So I'm also asking folks, how are we thinking ahead? How are we proactively creating inclusive spaces, communities, organizations? So how are we looking at our policy and program development, right? How are we building inclusive managerial teams, not just for today, but for tomorrow? What is the work of our employee resource groups or affinity spaces to help prepare people for tomorrow? So we're thinking of policies, right? Also thinking about like benefits, leave policies, health insurance policies, and so on. So that's my piece of advice, is not just to look at today, not just look at the past, but really begin to look ahead and forecast how can we proactively be inclusive for communities that don't yet exist.
Thank you. Ian, what's your piece of advice?
I love what Eric just said, and I think that that's so spot on. Shirley has said, on some level, some folks were a little bit blindsided that how organized groups against DEI were, right? And so really looking into the future is so important. So I love that a lot, Eric. I would say, once you look into the future and you get all this information and you're doing all these wonderful things, you really need to share that story in your organization. You need to really figure out how can you make sure that every pocket of the organization can see themselves in what you're doing. It's kind of challenging, right? But they can see something is happening that impacts them and that your organization is doing something, right? I think sometimes organizations do a lot, but nobody knows, right? And yes, they're measuring it even, they're making improvement. Not that many people know because in their little world, things feel very the same, right? Nothing has changed to me. I still work with this person that gives me microaggressions every day. And so I think it's just very important. At Dana-Farber, we went out on a tour last summer. We called it the ID&E Past, Present, and Future Impact Tour, where we did just that. We visited all the campuses and we just talked about what we're doing, what's not working. We heard from the voices of the workforce so that we can hear from them. What do you think is not working? But really just continuing to share, and then remember the why is the most important. Why this work is the most important is critical to be a part of that. Shirley.
Thanks. I'm going to stay on the topic of the future. So this week, the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce released a survey. It was about 800 young residents, 20 to 30 years old. And what it found was that 25% of them said they were planning to leave Greater Boston over the next 5 years. And when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize a lot of those who said who were leaving, 35% Black women, 31% LGBTQ. So some of our most diverse talent wants to leave Boston. So we have to think about how do we keep them here. And the top number one concern is housing that is affordable. So companies, organizations should use their platform to talk about this, to help the state, help cities. How do you create more housing? Because 25% of young people plan to move out in the next 5 years. And that's a big part of your diverse talent and future workforce. So we gotta, so we gotta figure out that part of the puzzle as well.
That's well said. Exactly. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and everyone in the audience today for your time. It's been a fascinating hour, and we really do hope the conversation has given you some insight how to strengthen your own diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. In closing, just want to put one plug in. I hope all of you have received the application for this year's Wage Equity Impact Awards, formerly known as the Innovative Initiatives. We changed the name this year and revised the application to encourage participation by all employers who saw positive change in closing gender and racial wage gaps through the implementation of any new policy. This is the way we get better, when we share ideas and we share things that work. So it doesn't have to be that innovative. It just has to work. So please consider applying, because we'd love to hear from you. And we're going to celebrate the winners at our Q2 event scheduled for Tuesday, June 11th, sorry. Again, thank you to our panelists. It's been wonderful. It's been a great discussion. And to all of you, have a great day.